Check the agreeable.
Awesome, you're agreeable. So welcome today to our lunch series. We are super fortunate to have a good friend of mine, Claire Casey, here today. So if you've been to any of the lunch series in the past, a lot of them are very focused on substance. You know, what are we going to do about bioweapons? What are we going to do about China? So today is a little bit different. Claire is going to talk to you about unconventional careers in foreign policy. So we met, I want to say like 5 years ago, on a Council on Foreign Relations trip to Southern Command. So we were in Tegucigalpa, murder capital of the world, together, and then Colombia and Puerto Rico, which was equally weird. But that fantastic trip sort of cemented this friendship, and she's just an amazing, interesting person. Anywhere in the world you've been, Claire has probably been there and, like, you know, knows the minister of whatever. So anyway, without further ado, I will let her talk, and you'll have lots of time to ask questions. So welcome, Claire.
Thank you. So it's great to be here with you. When I was thinking about this, when Rebecca first asked me to do it, my response was like, well, what would I possibly talk about with them? So we fixed on this idea of how you can build a career in foreign policy, national security world that is a little bit unconventional. So there are obvious paths to go. I feel like when I was a student, the obvious path was government. And it was one that was not appealing to me. I took the Foreign Service exam, didn't take the oral because I decided because I didn't want it, it was unethical to go in with no nervousness and win. And so I didn't do that. I grew up in the Foreign Service and didn't want that life, but I knew I wanted to work on policy. I knew I wanted to work on US national security issues and policy issues and engage with it. So I went to an NGO to start and tried that world out, where you're actually getting to work on really interesting issues and hopefully making a difference. And I didn't love that either because there was no profit motive. And I think, well, profit motive can be viewed as a dirty thing. It actually creates some efficiencies. But it was fascinating, and it's something I would highly recommend if anyone's interested in thinking about how you create stable countries and how you transition countries to stronger institutions. There are a lot of organizations in the DC area, namely under the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID funded programs where you do that work, and it's fascinating, and I learned a lot. I then went to SAIS, and I studied conflict management, although I did a ton of security studies work because and I still believe this, I think all students of security studies should be learning about how you end conflict and rebuild societies, and all students of conflict management should better understand how you wage and end wars, which is something that at least at SAIS was not super popular as an opinion. What I do now, and I'm going to skip ahead and then kind of take us back, what I do now is run something called Foreign Policy Analytics, and it is the independent research and advisory division of the FP Group, which publishes Foreign Policy Magazine, which you should all be reading. We need subscribers, as do all magazines today. But it's excellent. And the FP Group developed this division in part because media companies are trying to figure out how to better survive in the marketplace today and how you can have additional services. But what's been really fun about it is that you have a research group thinking about these critical issues that has a media platform behind it. And you're able to engage in a different way with the policy community in Washington, D.C. So the first report, we were founded in August 2016, and we immediately started working on what would be our first public report, which was called Foreign Policy in the Trump Administration. And it was actually I think it's the best project I've ever done in terms of my personal enjoyment of it. I got to run around Washington, D.C. and sit down with former secretaries of defense, USTRs, secretaries of state, and then undersecretaries and just people who are experts in the community, and talk to them what we should expect from the next president. They all thought it would be Hillary Clinton. And so the day after the election, that report went into the rubbish bin, and we started over and wrote a report about Donald Trump, his transition team, the key actors, and what people on a bipartisan basis thought the future of U.S. foreign policy would be. And that was a tremendous experience. in getting to actually see that the groupthink in DC does work out sometimes, and that in broad strokes, people understood what they were about to get. The one thing where they all sort of whiffed it completely was that no one thought he would touch North Korea. That it was just too complicated a problem. So that was the big surprise. I was just reflecting on this recently and went through it again to see what we got right and what we got wrong. And we got a lot right, and that one thing just terribly wrong. We do a lot of work. We're doing big projects on transatlantic security cooperation next year. We do a lot of work on sort of a broader view of foreign policy and sort of geopolitical competition. So looking at everything from how countries are preparing to deal with massive demographic change around aging, to looking at trade and competitiveness issues and how cities are leading in that. So sort of big tent foreign policy. So I wanted to talk about how one goes from being a grad student looking out at the world and trying to figure out how not to go into a think tank or government. Because I looked at think tanks, and I don't know your perceptions of this, but when I was leaving graduate school, my perception of think tanks was that there was a very entry-level role that you could get, and that it was very hard to build a career within a think tank. That you'd have to go somewhere else to sort of develop your reputation and your expertise, and then you can come in again at a very senior level. Where that is usually government. And I look back now at 40, at the people I know who are in sort of my role at think tanks. They may have started there, but they all spent some time in government. And I think that's great. I would actually, if things had gone differently after the election, I would have been trying to spend some time in government to get that experience. But I wanted to go a slightly different path. And the path I went, which I think is actually fascinating, but a little bit more challenging in terms of Washington, D.C., is consulting and research. And there are a lot of organizations that do that work, be they like big names like RAND, the Eurasia Group, and then small independent organizations. There are a lot of sort of Eminence Grise out there who leave government and start a little shop and offer very tailored services to corporate clients. And that's the direction that I went. I worked for Jeffrey Garten and David Rothkopf for about 12 years, building a business, advising corporations on geopolitical risk, economic trends, and with a focus also on energy and the environment in particular, and how that all existed within that broader context. It's fascinating work, and I would recommend it to anyone who likes to deal with different issues and to have a constant sort of churn of what you're focusing on, and who really likes to understand things. The challenge around a career in that direction, and that's kind of where I wanted to focus in today in terms of how you get to where you want to go, is that you're doing work that doesn't usually see the light of day. Your name is usually not on it. You're usually just one of the many people contributing to a product, even if it does actually go out into the world. And so it's more challenging, I think, and you're not in some vast bureaucracy like the Department of Defense or the Department of State or the intelligence community. So how do you build a network? How do you get your name out there? How do you develop expertise? I would say Council on Foreign Relations, where Rebecca and I met, is one of the most amazing opportunities. And I view term membership there, which is a 5-year young professional membership, as a turning point in my career in terms of the access that it gave me and the people that I was able to meet and learn from. So finding those organizations, and it's not just that one. And I think that actually Rebecca should be the one giving this talk, really, because she is involved in every one of these. I feel like you did the Aspen. There are so many different, there's the Truman Project, there are so many opportunities for young or mid-career professionals to not just get professional development, but build that network by being part of a structured and set program. So mapping those out, being keenly aware of the narrow window in which you're allowed to apply, because they're all arbitrary. It's like 30 to 35, below 30, and really having a sense, I think, at the outset of your career of what those opportunities are and how you might integrate it into your own professional development. Because you do learn things, but I think the greatest value is the network. And I wanted to speak a little bit about networking because when I was preparing for this, I was thinking about what ideas I had wrong at the beginning of my career. And you guys might have it all right, but what I had wrong was the idea that networking was a bit cynical. That there was something almost like craven about it, that people were just trying to build up, do it for themselves. And I would say that the exact opposite. DC gets a bad reputation of being a city where people are always sort of looking over your shoulder for the more important person in the room, and that happens. But developing a professional network can be a tremendous asset in terms of genuine connection and sort of provoking your thinking, getting you to be more aware of issues you hadn't been aware were on the horizon. And honestly, just having wonderful friendships in a lot of different areas, and having people you can call on. I had to give a talk about a week ago about the impact of the midterms on foreign policy, and I did not know one thing about that. I don't follow Capitol Hill. It makes my soul hurt to think about Capitol Hill, and so I avoid it. I just don't think about that stuff. And so I called 3 friends. One was a lobbyist. One was very, very involved in Dem, Thinktanks, politics stuff, and one worked on the Clinton campaign. And I was like, help! I'm gonna look like an idiot tomorrow, or it was Monday, and this was for Wednesday morning. Can you tell me what I should know? What are people talking about? What's real? What's not? And I very quickly, because those are real relationships, not transactional relationships, but real relationships, got answers. And I was able to do my job better because of that. So I think being really embracing networking and putting yourself out there and basically just asking people on dates all the time. They're not romantic dates, but not caring if you get no's. And when you meet someone go to meetings, get on every list of the things you're interested in. And then when you sit next to someone and you share a joke, give them your card and say, can we get coffee sometime? It sounds like you do something really interesting. And build that network, because that's how you get invited to you end up speaking on panels because of that. You end up here at Georgetown at lunch talking because you do that. It really does help you develop professionally. The second thing I would say, and I don't know if this is conventional wisdom or not, but it's my wisdom, which is develop a narrow expertise. Even if the work you're doing is really broad, people in Washington can't understand you if what you do is complicated. So I worked at a research firm that I was working on a million different projects that had really different areas of focus. But I quickly learned that I could not engage with the Washington community and say I work on 35 different things. I had to if you want to start getting viewed as an expert at the sort of mid-phase of your career, I think it's really important to decide the thing people are going to know you do. So for me, it was energy. And CFR had me on a panel with the guy who runs that, I think I was 35 years old or 34 years old, and he was 60, and they had us speak about the future of energy innovation in the United States. And that was an amazing opportunity, and so many other things came from that, working groups. But it was because they looked around and they were we want a woman on this panel, and it's not a field that is full of women. And so I got that opportunity and then ended up getting so much out of that. But having people understand that very narrow thing, you can broaden later. So I no longer position myself as an energy expert. I actually never really cared for energy. It was something I had to do. I thought it was sort of interesting. It connects everything, makes the world run. We fight wars over it. But there are people who are animated about a barrel of oil and what's going on with that, and that was never me. And so in the last few years, I've really broadened again, and that's been gratifying. But I do think that narrowing is important to get yourself out there and get people to take you seriously. Sort of the opposite side of that is I would recommend maintaining a really broad information diet so that you are able to expand your expertise and what you're able to speak to when you're ready for that. Read FP obviously, but other news sources and analytical resources that you have out there and go to lots of meetings, not just to meet people, but to hear what people are thinking and talking about, so that you're an interesting person. And the final tip I would have is write whenever you can outside of your job. And I am the worst offender of not doing this enough. Particularly if you do go the avenue where you're doing a lot of research and analysis, you're writing a lot at work, but your name's not on that work usually. And having pieces behind you, even though you're usually doing them after work or on a Sunday, every opportunity that you get to write, take that opportunity. I had the editor of the Daily Beast call me a month ago or 2 months ago, whenever the Helsinki happened, and the president said the thing about Nord Stream, and I hadn't thought about Nord Stream in like years. But Noah thinks of me as an energy expert. So the first thing he did when the president said that was give me a call and be like, can you get an article to us this afternoon on Nord Stream and what that means, and sort of an explainer about the whole situation and the situation with Germany and Poland and how it all is. And I spent a few hours and I wrote it and sent it to him, and it was in the Daily Beast the next day. Just because my philosophy is you don't turn down writing opportunities when they land in your lap. The flip side is how do you get them before they're landing in your lap? And this is where I am a bad offender, because I just respond to opportunities typically, and I don't tend to pitch a lot. That said, I'm part of an organization that gets a lot of pitches. I get a lot of pitches because people don't understand that I have absolutely no editorial control of foreign policy. But I do have to navigate that and navigate the editors. So some thinking on how you could think about establishing relationships with editors, having them know of you as someone who has interesting ideas. Don't send people full, complete articles usually, because they don't want to read them, and you're wasting your time. Send them an interesting idea and an unconventional angle and something that people are not already saying. So our editors are always looking for the perspective that they haven't seen out there, the challenge to the conventional wisdom, or the topic that people aren't talking about but should be. And a little short pitch will get you more of a response if they're intrigued than sending a long piece, because often, and particularly I think when you're starting out, it's a different kind of writing, and it's a writing that is, even for me, quite counterintuitive. It's not sort of the direction I naturally go, and so you're unlikely to write a first paragraph that will be appealing to them. So they may not get further than that. So if you put your whole idea and your pitch in your little blurb that you give them, you're more likely to get their attention. The other tip I had with that, and it has to do with the idea of being able to turn around an article really quickly, is I think one of the things that keeps us from writing and putting ourselves out there is that the practice of writing an 800-word article is not something we're used to doing in our jobs. Usually you're doing something much longer form, and it can be a bit daunting to think about how to distill an issue into 800 words. My mentor, one of the amazing things about the Council on Foreign Relations is that they have a formal mentorship program. So my mentor is a brilliant woman. She started in this Department of State, went to the National Security Council, maybe you can correct my pronunciation, it's the NagornoKarabakh, do you know what that is? It's like the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace agreement. She negotiated that, she's incredible. And then went to run Exxon's public policy, not public policy, sort of strategic thinking about the world for 15 years. I mean, the coolest job, because she wasn't actually having to do government relations, she just got to think about where things were going and what trends were emerging. And that would be fabulous if it weren't for Exxon. But she said to me, and I started to do it and did it for about 2 years, is at least once or twice a month, take 3 hours on a Saturday and write an op-ed. And it doesn't have to be an op-ed that goes anywhere. Just force yourself to get into the practice of taking an idea. It doesn't have to be a hard policy idea. One of my bugaboos is I think the common application creates systemic inequality. And I wrote an 800-word op-ed about why I thought that. And it's a great practice to be able to realize that everyone in this room is capable of turning around 800 words in a couple hours. And you actually probably do a better job when you have that time pressure, but it seems impossible, and it seems like, there's never gonna be enough time in the day to write. I have my job. If you get in the practice of doing that, you'll write better pieces, but you also, I think, will write more frequently and be able to respond to opportunities as they present themselves. All of that is to say that I think it really matters in Washington for your career for people to know you and recognize you as an expert. And I think the hardest part of that, and I have a big team that works with me, and the hardest thing I struggle with their professional development is owning your expertise. And being confident that your voice actually matters on these issues. I think that's a really hard step sometimes to take. For some people it might be really easy. For me it was a little challenging, and I have people in my office who know more about an issue than practically anyone on earth, but don't own that they're the expert in it. And I think that that's something that is a professional step where you have to say, no, I do know this. I know this really well. I've really studied it. I've got great ideas, and I want the world to hear those ideas. And when you have that professional confidence in the work you're doing, it makes it a lot easier to engage with peers and people who are more senior than you and have them start paying attention to what you're saying. And then opportunities develop and present themselves, and you can end up doing some really cool stuff. I was just telling Rebecca, I'm going to Abu Dhabi and Rome, start from November 9th to the 26th to do 2 live simulations, one of a South Asia nuclear crisis, and then in Rome we're going to be with people from all over the Mediterranean region, policy planners, working through a sort of day after tomorrow for Syria. And that's so much fun. And I'm really glad that I somehow wandered into a career where I get to do fun stuff like that. But I think that those opportunities are out there. I think they're less obvious when you're at the beginning of your career. And so that was kind of at least the starting point of what I hope will be a discussion.
What news sources or media do you consume before you start your day? What's your media diet?
Oh my God. So my media diet starts with Twitter, which I feel like is shameful, but it's actually not. So I was really resistant to Twitter when it came out, when everyone was using it, but I wasn't. And what I found, and this was when I was still really focused on energy, what I found was that you found out if you really curate your feed and don't fill it up with a bunch of just funny junk. I mean, most of what I post is funny junk, but if you look at it strategically and you really curate who you're listening to and who you're following. So I mean, I was going out and picking out the people who were stronger on the harder side of energy than I was. So that when they were posting about stuff, I was getting their insights and understanding, and I knew when an important new report would drop. That's the stuff that doesn't get into the news if you want to really develop an expertise on an issue. So when an important report comes out that that very defined community cares about, you know about it immediately. It might never be in the New York Times or even in, a trade publication, or it may take a few days for it to get into. And if you're going to a meeting on that topic, you want to be able to speak to that thing that just happened. So I actually find Twitter to be tremendously useful to get information, not necessarily news. I mean, I would say with everything else, I'm like everyone. I read the New York Times, Washington Post, I read foreign policy, and I'm not just plugging it because it pays my salary. Foreign policy is a great source of analysis and sort of going a little bit deeper on the issues. I don't read foreign affairs, admittedly, except when there's a major article that I need to be paying attention to, which I find out from other people usually, because I find it very dry. I read The Economist religiously because I think it's a great way to every week, I don't read the whole thing, but I feel like every week you can basically catch up on what's happening in the world. And so I think it's a tremendous resource in that sense. Yeah, and I go to a lot of meetings. I figured out for what I care about who does good work on it in DC, and then got on their lists. And then you get on the first list, and then you get onto the a couple years later, you get onto the private list where you're actually in the small conversations and people are off the record and being candid, and that's when you start really getting the insights and the ideas that shape future work and future projects, and just being an interesting person.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was curious about your thoughts on, a lot of these unconventional careers take you a little bit further away from like core foreign policy stuff and combines it with business and that kind of stuff. How do you kind of, if you did want to eventually, like, say you're currently in one of these unconventional careers and you want to pivot back?
Yeah, how was I going to do it? I mean, that's all I can say. I thought a lot about that because I really did aspire to spend 2 to 3 years inside the machine, just to see how it worked. I feel like at some point in your career, you do in DC need to have credibility. You need to kind of have functioned within government and understand how it works from the inside to be able to speak to it. So how I was going to do it was I thought about what I know and what I'm able to do and speak to, who I know, and how I could combine those things into something that was interesting. And what I decided, even though it was sort of unexpected for me, was that I wanted to be at DoD because they were one of the only organizations within the government that actually had money and resources dedicated, in terms of people, dedicated to thinking strategically about the future. I think policy planning at state would be the only other place, but if you talk, I spent a lot of time talking to people in policy planning and working with them, and they tend to feel like they're just reacting. They don't actually get to do the kind of long-term thinking, and so thinking strategically about the future, it seemed like the organization that would have that that opportunity. And I also was working on a campaign and connecting with people who were going to be in the Department of Defense at a very senior level around energy and the environment, which is a major long-term issue. And that was an area that they understood me in. And so was it the perfect fit? Possibly not, but it was my way in. And I had a whole plan of how to then take the energy and the environment and move it more into the sort of foresight and strategic stuff. But then Donald Trump. This isn't, I'm openly partisan. I have a belief, and it's I think a belief that's growing in media, and I'm not in media, but as a researcher, I'm very open about the fact that I'm a registered Democrat who raises money for Democrats, because I think as long as you make your biases known, your work is more legitimate. And we try within our organization, FP Analytics, our philosophy, and I think we're really lucky, working with corporations, particularly when you're feeding their internal strategic thinking, unlike most of DC, which is around advocacy, your job is just to come up with the best right answer about what's going on in the world, because you're not advocating for anything. You're trying to give them the best insight into what's actually happening. And so that was our sort of guiding principle always, like intense independence and rigor. And so I disagree often with policies on both sides of the aisle. I'm super pro-trade in a way that a lot of Dems aren't, and I'm a hawk in a lot of ways on security issues. But yeah, so that's politically, I mean, you could probably actually speak to that more than I could, but I've never been tempted to sort of enter the bureaucracy. I've been tempted to go in for a political appointment. And that's what there's a huge group of people who go in and out every cycle with that. Yes?
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about pivoting your expertise. So you spoke a lot about how it's important to have an expertise, and for instance, in your case it was energy.
Yeah.
When you're trying to move away from that particular area, how, do you have any advice or anything to say on that front? Like, so you're not getting stuck working on the same material that you no longer want to brand yourself as?
Right. So, I mean, I think what I'm talking about is more of a public pivot. So, if you don't want to be stuck doing one specific thing, I would not go into an organization that only does that thing. Whereas if you go into a broader organization, you will probably have the opportunity to move and work on different things. how you publicly pivot yourself is, I think, actually very natural in your career, because as you grow into leadership positions, you kind of naturally broaden the scope of the work you're doing, and then you can translate that into your public how people perceive you publicly. So I speak now regularly on aging, and did I ever expect that? No. Would that have been my strategy for how I would broaden myself? No. But it's sort of, once you start getting out there in a bunch of different areas, people just naturally perceive you differently. In terms of pivoting within your career, it's hard. And I think that one of the things you want to be thinking about is there's issue expertise and then there's skill sets. And if you're developing the skill set alongside the issue expertise, you can let the skill set drive what you do next, not the issue expertise. I went to college with a guy whose career kind of amazes me, actually. And he was in the Obama White House. You would never have thought this from him in college, but he ended up in the Obama White House doing like the bailout of the auto companies, and then was working on some security stuff, and now is at Columbia and their energy program, which I just find like, why are you there? And then I was on Twitter the other day, and people were like, what about him for Supreme Court Justice? And I was like, oh, come on. So, I mean, just being willing to, I don't know, go for it. And again, this is sort of like claiming expertise. And I'll just say this, I think women have a harder time with this than men do. And that we have a hard time just being like, it's me, I'm great at this, or I'm just super smart, and I can learn anything and be good at anything pretty quickly. And it's something that fighting structure, but then also fighting the things that hold us back internally.
So you mentioned how it's important to really get into writing and practice
Yeah.
it. Do you have any tips on trying to write when in a crunch, or like how to get started and like how to maybe get unstuck?
So I have my own. I'm going to answer that from my own perspective and then my perspective as a manager who manages other people. So I can't write an article until I write the first paragraph. Because that's where I conceptualize it all, and until like I have that first sentence perfect, nothing else comes. But then once I have that first sentence perfect, it just all like is on the paper in an hour for something short. That's me, and that's just how my brain works. I've found generally with my team that if they're stuck, the easiest thing that breaks through that being stuck is to stop trying to write and to go back to like throw that piece of paper away or put it aside and to just bullet out the major points you want to make and start structuring that, and then just say, sometimes I'm like, let's put the introduction aside. You know the content for what you want to say on this specific issue. Just write me a paragraph, and I want it in 20 minutes because I don't want you laboring over it. I want you just to we just decided this one piece, write that paragraph. If there's another idea, write that paragraph. And then you build back to that introduction that you probably knew inside the whole time, but you were getting stuck with. And that has been how we've gotten folks who were kind of just getting sort of turned around. I'm also a big believer in outlines. Because it forces a discipline and structure and thinking. Not everyone likes to do outlines, but if you can't write your outline, you probably don't know what you want to say. And then that's a whole other issue. But it forces structure and thinking, and it also enables you to then pick what you think would be the easiest paragraph to write and start there, because then you know where that fits in the broader scheme of things.
Could you talk about unconventional ways of obtaining security clearances?
I cannot talk to that. Sorry. The one unconventional way I will say is that there are these groups, and I have no idea how you get invited to be in them other than being known for being really good at your thing. So I have a dear friend who he's now the chief technology officer for the biggest Indian renewable energy company, but he is an energy expert, and so and he's done a ton of work, and he publishes constantly, like manically. And he was invited by the U.S. government and by USTR to be on their energy review committee of trade negotiations and agreements, and so he got a security clearance to be able to access those documents. So that's unconventional in terms of outside in and not going through the traditional process. And I think it's a low level clearance, but it's a start.
Media related, I know
Yeah.
you're kind of media adjacent, but
Yeah, that's a good. I should use that.
where do you see at present the foreign policy, journalism, and media industry, and where do you see it going? Because it seems like a very, I know disruptive is kind of a cliche term, but disrupted time in that industry. Can you talk about kind of the changes you've seen and are seeing?
Yeah. So I'm not going to surprise anyone here in saying that media companies are grappling with the vast amount of information available to people, and how you make information worth paying for. I can tell you how we're thinking about it. There are so many different models, and everyone's experimenting, and everyone's trying to figure out the right path forward. We are thinking about journalism and reporting as part of a bigger business. So that's my business is part of that approach. Doing events and simulations is part of that approach. Sort of how does that platform combine with other revenue opportunities that might have a better margin than just doing really good reporting. We have decided to focus on quality, not quantity. So we probably publish less than half the articles that we published 2 years ago, and have the same site traffic basically because the articles are better and more interesting and thoughtful. And so that's a strategy that I was actually just looking at a chart that we were presenting our quarterly results and saw that these are all metrics that people are using on online websites, and we have no way of telling how you're engaging with your print magazine. But we can see that in the last 2 years since we did this strategy, the time spent on site when someone clicks into foreign policy has gone up by like 4 times. So they're spending 4 times as long on the site than they used to before. So that is focusing on quality, not quantity, focusing on analysis, not just news. So giving people what they can't get somewhere else. Beyond that, it's a really daunting landscape. But at the same time, I do feel like we're at a moment, every serious news organization in the last 2 years has been doing better because people do want, I think there's a realization that we took serious reporting for granted and that we allowed a function that is critical to our democracy to begin to wither. So you're seeing people coming back in and I think being willing to pay for good work. You're seeing, every organization's dream is the idea that some great benefactor comes in without a political agenda and just funds their independent, excellent work. That's not going to actually be, I think, the solution. It can work a couple times, but it also is fraught with risk. And so, I think just the focus is doing the work better, not being part of the flood of information, but doing the really value-added information. We're trying to figure out a model where we combine analytics with journalism that's more of a hybrid product. So like next year, you might start seeing FP special reports, which are like more in-depth, like 10 to 15 page, analytically driven reports on issues that are very newsy issues, but are more than a journalist would do in terms of, or rather, I know some organizations like the New York Times can really fund that kind of stuff internally, but it wouldn't be the average thing you'd see in foreign policy. So just trying to figure out how to get people to pay for really good stuff. And nobody has it figured out. Well, The Atlantic, I think, has it figured out. They're like one of the only profitable shops in the magazine space. So we'll see. I don't think it's a surprise. It's not secret information that we're not profitable. Nobody is.
I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about what it's like doing foreign policy analysis for private sector clients, and then also related, maybe this is too specific, but I was just wondering if big tech is becoming either a bigger issue or a client or whatever.
Yeah. So I actually, the upside of doing foreign policy analysis for private sector clients, if you are discerning in who you take on as clients, is what I said before about the fact that they're truly looking for the right answer, because they're trying to navigate risk. And so if you're able, you can do fascinating work and dig into the most interesting issues in the world through the perspective of how does this affect how people engage with their governments, how markets function, how supply chains work, how companies and governments interact with one another and shifting power there. There's so much fascinating stuff you can do, and the questions I get from my private sector clients are so much more forward-looking and thoughtful usually than public sector institutions or international financial institutions. The downside is it's like it goes into the abyss. Like you have no way of knowing how your work impacted anything. So I prefer our public-facing projects. What I try to do with our work is find areas, in terms of engaging with the private sector, find areas that are actually valuable for the public discourse. One that I'm trying to get someone to fund right now, and I think it's going to go forward, is looking at road safety issues in Asia. So there's some really rapidly developing auto markets there, and people, I mean, it's just like devastating the acceleration of vehicle-related fatalities in those markets, and it's only going to get worse. And the infrastructure isn't there to make, and you have mixed I mean, like we have scooters, you guys probably all use scooters, and I'm gonna offend you, but it's like what's happening here. Like we're actually going towards like an Indonesia model of like a buggy and a car and a bicycle all on the road together, and that's what kills people. So it's kind of scary that we're kind of going in that direction. But thinking about that issue, there are actually a lot of companies that would love to be out in front on safety and fund something that's independent, but actually also goes out to the world and has a positive impact, but they get their name, the sort of halo effect of, we tried to contribute to reduce traffic fatalities in Asia. So that's our current sort of model of working with the private sector primarily, except for our legacy clients. But yeah, I generally think that it's very nice to not work on advocacy. There are a lot of people in this town, and there are a lot of places to go where your job is to come up with the answer that advances the agenda. I would say my worst experience with that is going to be unexpected, which is the World Wildlife Foundation or Fund. What's WWF? What's the F? I don't know. They launched a magazine. And they were a client. We were working on electrification of least developed countries, which is a great issue, one I'm passionate about, and I was excited to work with them on it. And they asked me to write an article about the security impact of climate change, which I did. So climate change is a national security issue. And then we were getting towards publication, and they were like, oh, they fixed some language in it where they said we had all the solutions to climate change, we just didn't have the political will to actually achieve it. I was like, well, that's wrong. We don't have that. And they were like, but that's our line. And so it's not really, like, people who will try to influence you are more people focused on advocacy agendas. It doesn't matter if they're private or public sector. When I did Battle, I ended up winning, and it ended up getting published without that line in it. But I would say it's less a question of who you're working for, and it's more a question of how you approach that work. And if what you're selling is your independence and the rigor of what you're doing, that's the client you want. Doesn't matter what sector they come from. Okay, that was fast.
Can you talk about careers in journalism then, as you see it from the foreign policy perch? Like how would a student dip their toe into that world?
Journalism? Yeah. So, well, we have something called the Foreign Policy Fellow, two every year, who are fabulous. and they come in for a year as the sort of starting point of a journalism career, and it's a year-long term. They rarely stay, but they always go on to amazing things. No one starts in that position having not written for their campus newspaper and already have significant writing behind them. So if that's of interest, you should be writing now, even if it's not for a major publication, even if it's for your school publication. That's what they're looking for, is that there are people who start a career more along the lines of what I did and shift into journalism because they developed the issue or expertise. There's a woman named Emily Tamkin at, where is Emily now?
BuzzFeed, I think.
Huh?
BuzzFeed,
yes. Sorry, I didn't. Yeah, so Emily's at BuzzFeed. She was at Foreign Policy, but she was a Russia analyst. And that's what she knew really well. And then she then parlayed that expertise into foreign policy. And she learned how to become a journalist with an amazing editor. So we have this incredible editor, Sharon Weinberger, who's now at Yahoo News, and she knows how to develop a journalist. And I have a lot of friends in that community, and there's something that people think generally, which is that like there are people who are really good reporters and there are people who are really good writers, and they often are not the same people. And so those are really different skill sets that you have to develop. And the best way to do it is someone, and that's across journalism or any other part of your career, the best thing you can do is find a boss who will invest in you and spend time helping you become better at what you do. I am deeply grateful to the people I've worked for over the years for being critical and challenging me and helping me see. Jeff Garten, who was Undersecretary of Commerce in the Clinton administration, then went on to run the Yale School of Management, told me when I was like 27 years old that if I didn't put that every PowerPoint slide you ever make should have a subtitle. Because if you don't know what the subtitle is, you don't actually know what the slide is about. It's probably just a bunch of random stuff that you put on it. And I still remember that. So finding mentors, whether it's your boss or someone else in the organization, and developing that skill set. Because no one's expected to know. You just have to know something and to come in with some value. And I will say, as someone who hires, attitude is 90% of it. Very few people come in with innate abilities at the start of their career, or that you can't tell if they have them or not in an interview. That's a hard thing, but figuring out if someone is a self-starter, committed, ambitious, passionate about the work we do, that's something that will go a long, long way. In DC, you're so lucky. I mean, I always think about this, like how amazing that we live in a town where 90% of the people we engage with are passionate about the work they do. I mean, if I go to like Raleigh, North Carolina and see my family, they're not talking about their jobs the way that we talk about our jobs. And sometimes people view that as negative, like we're all obsessed with our work, but how cool that we spend most of our day doing something that we actually animates us and gives us a sense of fulfillment. One more.
Yeah, can you talk about the simulations?
Oh yeah, so Peace Game is something we've been doing for about 5 years. It's my favorite project. The idea was, I was cooked up originally with USIP, although we now partner with Harvard on it. And there will actually be a Georgetown student at the one we're hosting in Abu Dhabi in November. The Peace Game, the sort of starting point of it was that there are all these war games and there are all these simulations about how to win. And what if, well, not all wars are winnable, or there isn't the actual will in the international community to win it. So why don't we approach the building of peace, or reaching peace, achieving peaceful outcomes with that same seriousness, or the same sort of creativity. And so we started something called the Peace Game, which is a day-long simulation of, we started with intractable conflicts, and tried to kind of force creative thinking. So people got around a table, they're all playing roles, we advance them through a series of moves, and they have to grapple with the challenges that are being put in front of them. we've evolved it over the years to do different things. When we did our last, I guess we've done Libya recently, but before that, or actually right after the inauguration, we did one about sort of, instead of placing ourselves within an existing challenge, we looked at sort of areas where you could see a situation rapidly escalate out of control. And so we looked at something involving Iran and the US in the Persian Gulf. And we, amazingly, we were looking at something in Israel, Palestine, and I was working with this expert in the Belfer Center, and we were trying to come up with the provocation that would start the next Intifada. And we were like, should we have them move the Jerusalem embassy? Nah, that's too crazy. So we did something much less serious than that. And that one was actually fascinating because it helped the people around the table see how quickly the escalation occurred and how hard it was to de-escalate it, which was fascinating. We now do something called the Future Diplomats Peace Game, which is what the Georgetown student is participating in, where we fly 30 students from around the world to Abu Dhabi. The Emirates Diplomatic Academy is the host, and they are in teams of 2. You can't play your own country, and you can't play a country with someone from your country, so you meet people from all over the world, and they do a day-long simulation. And our first one was cyber. We had a cyber attack, and it was fascinating. So it's a day of training where you learn all about that issue, and then the simulation, which is in front of a live audience. Yeah, it's a fantastic, I think it's a fantastic experience for the participants. We learn a lot in terms of thinking about issues differently. I felt like the students were so much more creative. We do it with experts usually, and they're like, party line, this is what we've always done. And with students, the thinking was much more outside the box and creative and thoughtful. And also, and this is me being a bit of a idealist, but I like the idea of a network of young diplomats or future diplomats or people working on foreign policy who know each other from around the world and have spent a few days together playing a game, essentially. But we have students from Russia, we have students from South Africa, India. I mean, we're gonna do South Asia and a nuclear crisis, and unfortunately we haven't been able to get a Pakistani in the room, which is too bad because it would be ideal to have them there and to be able to talk through that issue with someone who may one day have a position of power, and have a colleague in India that they like and trust. But that's my idealistic side. Okay, I guess that's it. It was nice to be with all of you today.
Thank you so much for joining us.